Racing has its myths and legends just like any other sport. In hockey, there's the legend that is Wayne Gretzky. In sprinting, you've got Usain Bolt. In football, it's Pele, Maradona, Messi and other legends like that. But in other sports on top of racing, you've also got things that have been named for the person that did that thing or where it happened, and things are basically named for something weird and wonderful that has gone on within that sport, if you follow me. Going back to hockey, there's the Gordie Howe hat-trick, the Bosman rule in football, also known as the free transfer clause, the sheer amount of moves in gymnastics named after the first person to do them, the list goes on. One for the aviation fans out there, there's the Immelman, where you do a half loop but roll out upside down to return the direction from whence you came. And there's also sillier ones out there like doing a Wigan, where a team plays like utter crap through the entirety of a season, but then strings together a series of results that ensures that that team doesn't get relegated at the end, as Wigan Athletics somehow managed to do for about 10 seasons. And they won an FA Cup. Pure shithousery. In motorsport, there's things like the gurney flap, something I need to do a video on in the future because, well, that thing is now everywhere. A simple invention developed by Dan Gurney that can increase downforce with minimal drag added to the car, I think. I mean, like I said, I need to go into it a bit more. But after the Canadian Grand Prix of 1999, we ended up with something that has only been known as one thing since that particular race. The Wall of Champions. The Wall of Champions sounds like some sort of Hall of Fame, doesn't it? Or something they'd have at Indianapolis for every winner of the 500, or at Le Mans for every winner there. Or it sounds like some sort of Walk of Fame thing. But while Formula 1 does indeed have a Hall of Fame these days, the Wall of Champions is completely unrelated. The 1999 season was, well, it was a little underwhelming, I guess you could call it. Only because of what happened at the British Grand Prix, a video I've done previously which was the turning point for that whole season. The 1999 season was part 2 of the fight between Michael Schumacher and Mika Hakkinen, with the previous season also ending in quite underwhelming circumstances because at the final race, it wasn't what you wanted to see. Because back then there could be huge gaps between the races, you could be kept waiting forever, and because there was no internet and only teletext to keep up with stuff, the gap between the Luxembourg Grand Prix at the Nürburgring and the Japanese Grand Prix, that was over a month, and it was excruciating because you were waiting for that final race. The Nürburgring race was held on the 27th of September 1998, and the Japanese Grand Prix was on the 1st of November. Long story short, the Michael stalled his car on the grid, had to start from the back, and then got a puncture later on, meaning that for the second year in a row he had to watch from the side of the track while his title rival went on to take the championship. So for 1999, things were stepped up. Ferrari had an even better car, Schumacher was doing very well, and Hakkinen was also on form. So it was kind of like, well, will we actually get to see a straight fight right until the last lap of the final race of the season? But, as already mentioned, Silverstone happened. It was a topsy-turvy season from the beginning. At the Australian Grand Prix, Schumacher's season had started how his previous one ended and he'd stalled his car, resulting in a back-of-grid start. Instead, it was Schumacher's teammate Eddie Irvine that won the race, and over the first few rounds up to Spain, which was round 5 that year, Schumacher had taken advantage of several McLaren retirements to lead the championship by 6 points, with Hakkinen in second, Irvine in third, Frentzen in fourth for Jordan, and Coulthard way down in fifth. Coulthard's car was falling apart at any given opportunity, and up to the end of the Spanish Grand Prix, he'd only finished 2 races all year, both of them second places. The thing is, Hakkinen had won 2 races in Brazil and Spain. Schumacher had won at Imola and Monaco, but Schumacher had scored at every race except Australia, which gave him the advantage over Hakkinen, who had retired at Australia and also at Imola. The second of those retirements happening right in front of the Tifosi, and he'd do the same again at Monza. So as the F1 paddock went for that weird little away day in Montreal at the start of June, it was still between the Lord of Sisu and the German, but the German had the advantage. And a more reliable car. Now I've done a video on Montreal and its weird place on the calendar before, but I'll just recap it so you've got the information to hand, if only so you can school people who whine about it being there on the internet. Basically, Montreal gets cold. If it was to be at the start of the season with Miami, Montreal is, well, too cold. And if it's later in the season with Vegas and Austin, it's also too cold. And if you try to move the other races around to be with it, then you have problems there too. Miami in October, it has to battle with the NFL season and the risk of hurricanes. Texas in July is a solid no out of 10, and so is Vegas. So at the end of it all, Montreal has to sit in that little bubble after Monaco because that's when Montreal's weather is going to be at its best. A race in Canada is actually the coldest Formula 1 race on record, 5 degrees Celsius in 1978. It can still snow in May in Montreal. Now, the circuit Gilles Villeneuve is weirdly one of my favourite tracks to drive in Formula 1 games. I don't know why, it just is. Along with Melbourne, Silverstone and Sochi. Yeah, I know. Maybe it's because Sochi's got a lot of medium speed corners to just try and lob the car in, but anyway, Montreal is fast and can be challenging because it's got quite a slippery surface. It's also a street circuit without being a street circuit, since on the exit of several corners like 2, 4, 7 and 9, there's no runoff. So if you slide coming out of one of those, you're on a taking your wheel off speed run. But what that means is the cars are threading the eye of the needle. Not as much as they would be at Monaco, but the final chicane takes a lot of commitment, and on the TV broadcasts of the time, it was great to watch. They braked late, tried to go as fast as possible, and then maximised the run to the line, without hitting that wall on the outside. And in qualifying, it was the first time a McLaren hadn't been seen on pole position. Schumacher was fastest, just 0.029 seconds ahead of Häkkinen, with the teammates coming in 3rd and 4th in the same order as their team leaders. The front three separated by almost 1.5 tenths, with the gaps getting bigger and bigger the further you went down. Such was the difference in car performance those days. De La Rosa, Badoa and Genet would be getting memed left, right and centre today, but in those days, this was normal. But saying that, the gaps weren't that big compared to the rest of the season. At other tracks, it could be about 13th or 14th down to last that would be 2.5 to 3 seconds off the pace, so this was actually quite a close qualifying session for the time. And as some extra info here, while it looked close, Schumacher was actually cruising. His fastest time was set on his first time lap of the day, and he only completed 7 of the 12 allocated laps he was allowed to use, with a second lap attempt thwarted by yellow flags. Mika described himself as being happy with second. Just happy. At least the start was a little bit less mayhem-laden than it had been in 1998. As they left the line, Schumacher did his usual "fuck you" chop across in front of Häkkinen to try and keep the lead into turn 1, stuff that would just never fly today. A little bit further back though, Trulli had to take avoiding action and went across the grass at turn 1 because of the big checker that happens into that particular corner, and he ended up smashing into Jean Alesi and also ended up hitting Barrichello. Barrichello would retire a couple of laps later with broken steering. The race was put behind the safety car as opposed to being stopped, and everything was cleared for a restart on lap 3, with Schumacher shooting off into an early lead. But that was all undone when Zonta crashed at the final chicane, resulting in the safety car coming out again. So really, the race started on lap 6. Schumacher once again got the better of Häkkinen and off he went into the lead once more, his Ferrari seemingly having better race pace, or Häkkinen had more fuel. Yeah, it was a different time. I know how people say they went harder in those days, but Häkkinen didn't really need to push if Schumacher was running lighter. Maybe a video on those old strategies is in order. On lap 14, the wall at the final chicane claimed its 3rd victim of the weekend. And you might be thinking, hang on a second, you've only just mentioned the wall now. What about the other two? Well, Ralf Schumacher had gone into the wall in practice, Zonta had brought out the second safety car when he crashed into the wall, but this time it was a former world champion that had gone in there, Damon Hill. The chicane in the final portion of the lap is the best part of the circuit, because you enter the braking zone doing about 200 miles an hour, and then you've got to thread the car through a gap that's basically a one-way trip to the wall if you screw it up, especially today with things like sausage curbs and all that other stuff. But in those days, sausage curbs hadn't been invented, and instead the curbs were just a tiny bit higher, and behind them was just grass. The cars in those days were also down on grip slightly. The rules for 1999 had said that the cars had to have 4 grooves in the tyres at the front and 4 grooves at the rear. In 1998 it was 3 on the front and 4 on the rear. On top of this, cars are on edge anyway because Montreal needs top speed but also turning, and as mentioned already, it's a slippery track, so the cars would end up being a bit front heavy on the downforce. Too much front end, you'll spin on corner entry because the front end is more loaded up than the rear, and if you have too much on the rear downforce, you're just not going to turn in at all. So you want to maximise the top speed down the 2 straights and still get through without spinning. So things might have just been borderline in how they were getting through in terms of the balance. What Damon had done is that he'd gone into the corner, hit the curb which unsettled the car, and as he tried to correct, that was it. He was done. The car stepped out the rear and started to go around, and the right rear tyre hit the wall with the suspension being broken. Damon stopped the car on the grass verge and had a short walk back to the garages. Amazingly, they left the car on that verge about 100 metres from that exit curbing. Talk about stuff that wouldn't happen today. This was good for the Michael because then the pack wouldn't be backed up through the safety car. Because of where Damon's car had ended up, they deemed it safe enough to just leave it there because it was off the racing line, but it's still something that wouldn't have happened today. So no safety car, they could just carry on, although the pit stop strategies were a little bit off. But 15 laps later, it was Michael who ended up in the wall. The then two-time champion had made an error at the same place Damon had done. Michael was gunning it for a few laps to try and maximise the gap for his pit stop, but he made almost the exact same mistake. He'd hit the curb too hard. In Schumacher's case, he'd taken too much of the left-hand curbing that takes you onto the start-finish, and that must have either bottomed out the car or otherwise unsettled it, and he smacked the outside wall with the right front rather than the right rear. But again, no safety car. And Schumacher said afterwards, "It was quite clearly a mistake by myself. I seem to make one a year and hopefully that's the last one I make for the year." I mean, in his defence, it was his brakes that went at Silverstone rather than it being driver error, but one error a year? Let's test that. 1994 is take your pick from Silverstone or Adelaide, but it depends on your criteria for a mistake. 1995, I can't find or remember one. 1996, he stuffed it into a wall lap one at Monaco. 1997, I guess you could say that Jerez was a pretty big one. 1998, he went autocrossing at Austria. I won't count the stalling at Suzuka. And then in 1999, he did this. So the next one would probably be, 2004, when him and Montoya crashed in the tunnel? Answers on a postcard. So Hakkinen now led Irvine, Coulthard, Fisichella and Frentzen. Behind the man with the most wholesome Twitter account was Ralph and Pedro Diniz, having a quiet but also great race at the time. But the final victim of the day, also an ex-champion, was approaching. Just 5 laps after Michael, Villeneuve's BAR went into the wall. Unlike Damon and Michael, JV had gone in nose first and there wasn't much they could do in the way of a quick retrieval, so the safety car had to be called, with Hakkinen and others taking advantage of the Montreal pit lane layout to take fuel and tyres, and then form up behind the safety car. When the race restarted, Hakkinen led the lapped Bedoya and Panis, while Irvine and Coulthard had handbags into turn 1. Now, Irvine had been throwing shade at DC all weekend, so when the race restarted, DC tried to overtake Irvine, but they ended up clashing. Irvine was spun round, and Coulthard had to pit for a new nose cone. But Irvine wasn't the only one on a wind-up, because Fisichella saw Olivier Panis as a target. The Prost and the Minardi of Bedoya were battling, but because Olivier was so focused on the Minardi, he never saw the blue flags, leading Fizzy to say, "Is he colourblind? Someone should mention to Alan that he should tell his drivers what to do when they see a flag that's the same colour as the car." Fizzy would end up losing second to Frentzen as HHF overtook all 3 cars in the hold-up, and because they were both taking the piss, the Prost and the Minardi got stop-go penalties for it. They weren't the only ones to get penalties. DC got one for speeding in the pit lane, and Zanardi also got one for holding up faster traffic. Later in the race though, Frentzen crashed out of the race at turn 3, a crash so severe they found a bruise on his brain afterwards, and he'd also got a hairline fracture. He spent 3 days in hospital but was going to be fine for the French Grand Prix, which he would go on to win. But Hakkinen, out in front, cruised home to, in a way, rescue Mercedes. Because that same weekend, and I really mean that exact same weekend, Peter Dumbreck and Mark Webber had been doing their backflips in the CLRs at Le Mans, which was also the 45th anniversary of the 1955 Le Mans disaster, which also involved a Mercedes car. Yeah, it was all screwed up. So behind the safety car, Hakkinen led home from Fisichella and Irvine, who had been on a charge after his tussle with DC, and ended up overtaking Herbert Stewart at the chicane, with both cars cutting it. Ralph was 4th with Herbert 5th on Jackie Stewart's birthday, and the final points paying position was taken by Pedro Diniz. The times are so close together because the race had ended behind the safety car. Well, safety car had come in, but in those days you couldn't overtake until the start line. It meant that Hakkinen took a 4-point lead in the driver's standings. Fisichella's 2nd place moved him up 2 places, while Johnny Herbert's 5th leaped him up 10. Only giving points for the top 6 finishers really did mess stuff about. Meanwhile, Ferrari still led the constructors from McLaren, with Benetton and Sauber making gains due to how the race went. Even though we know what we know now, at the time, there was a lot of excitement for the championship. On top of this, the race did draw some criticism. While Damon, Michael and JV all admitted their crashes were down to driver error, with Jack Villeneuve also blaming dust dragged onto the track by other cars, the 3 drivers and Frentzen all said their accidents would never have happened if they'd got full slick tyres. One reviewer at the time said that Formula 1 was now starting to swing between boring, safe processions where things were being sorted in the pit stops, or the races were dangerously spectacular ones like the one seen in Canada. Because in this race, the following happened. Trulli was accused of dangerous driving at the start, and that crash actually took a chunk of Barrichello's helmet out, but Trulli later apologised. Panis and Badoa didn't notice blue flags, nor were told by their teams that they were being lapped. One driver was hospitalised for 3 days with a bleed on the brain, 2 cars had overtaken each other while cutting the grass, and 3 cars had shunted into a concrete wall with cars that were twitchy as hell thanks to the FIA's tyres. At least, that's what they blamed, despite also admitting driver error. But out of it, we got the Wall of Champions, and ironically, it was the 1994, 1995, 1996 and 1997 champions that hit it. But since the 1999 Canadian Grand Prix, it has only claimed 2 more victims. Jenson Button hit it in 2005, even though he wasn't a champion at the time, and Sebastian Vettel hit it in 2011, with a marshal falling over in a comical fashion on his way to the car. Also, having a wall there that people are going to hit with "Welcome to Quebec" written in huge letters on it is some sort of extra kick in the teeth. Welcome to Quebec, bud, you're about to have a warm welcome, eh? So then, who will be the next victim? I fully expect the very predictable comments about Stroll ending up in that wall, but there are 3 champions on the grid: Hamilton, Verstappen and Alonso. Those, plus Hakkinen, Raikkonen and Rosberg, seem to be the only ones that have avoided hitting that wall of champions. For now, anyway, one of those 3 drivers could still hit the wall at the upcoming Canadian Grand Prix in 2024. But at the same time, it does show how few people have won the championship since 1999, doesn't it? So then, a look at the chaotic 1999 Canadian Grand Prix and the birth of the Wall of Champions. If this has been an interesting look through the history books, then do give this video a like so I know I've done a good job, and for more like this, get subscribed with the bell on so you never miss out on anything else I do around here. A massive thanks as ever to the rad lads at Patreon for the continued support, and if you want to help out at a more personal level, then there's links to Patreon, Discord, socials and affiliates all down in the description for you. Or there's super thanks and memberships if that's more your thing. So until next time, I've been AdmiralLaWind, have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.